All right, Krystal, what are you taking a look at?
Washington Post's Greg Jaffe is out with a profile of Starbucks founder, CEO, and union buster extraordinaire Howard Schulz. It's a sort of a mirror image of a profile that Jaffe did a while back of Jazz Brizak. She was one of the lead worker organizers in Buffalo. She helped to jumpstart that whole organizing firestorm. And by digging into Schultz's anti-union obsession, Jaffe reveals a lot about billionaires and the way they rationalize their wrongdoing. So here is that new profile. It's headlined, Howard Schultz's Fight to Stop a Starbucks Barista Uprising. In it, Jaffe writes of Schultz, quote, "The 69-year-old CEO had always seen himself as the good guy of American capitalism, believing that his own wealth and Starbucks' rise to become one of the most ubiquitous brands on the planet was a direct outgrowth of the company's concern for its workers and their well-being. Only now, all of that was being challenged. Across America, workers who had labored through a once-in-a-century pandemic were concluding that they deserved better and were quitting or demanding more from their bosses, or in the case of some Starbucks workers, unionizing." Good guy of American capitalism. Gotta love it. Now, Starbucks, of course, in the business of selling coffee, but they also sell a sort of progressive ethos and aesthetic. Its brand is situated perfectly in that late 90s and early 2000s ideology of doing well by doing good. The idea that there didn't have to be a conflict between your liberal values and your desire to cash in. It was the same mentality sold to a generation of bright would-be activists who, instead of fomenting real change, persuaded themselves that the best way to do good in the world was to maybe get an MBA and land a stint at McKinsey Consulting. Very Clinton and Obama era way of thinking, and a very Howard Schultz way of thinking as well. Now, for decades, it worked out pretty well for Schultz. The Starbucks do-gooder brand aesthetic made Schultz personally feel good, also landed with a highly profitable market among affluent urban and suburban types. But now, that do-gooder liberal image has crashed directly into the desires and aspirations of Starbucks' mostly low-paid workforce. And in that collision, it becomes super clear that any investments that Schultz had made into those baristas were ultimately governed by business logic, not by any actual commitment to their well-being. As Jaffe explains in this profile, quote, "Schultz found that customers would spend more if their barista knew their order and a little about them." Translation: it was profitable for Starbucks to invest a little bit in their so-called partners so that they'd stick around long enough to learn those important little customer details. Now, this self-appointed good guy of American capitalism, he's been thoroughly revealed. And behind the mask is exactly the same thing behind the mask of every billionaire corporate executive. Whether it's the ruthless Bezos, the trolling Musk, or the liberal Schultz, at the end of their day, they want their power. And so when faced with the movement of workers demanding a say in their workplaces, Schultz has become one of the most aggressive, lawless union busters in the entire country. Starbucks has illegally fired workers across the nation for organizing, including 7 workers at a union Memphis Starbucks that the courts have forced them to rehire. They've closed stores that have unionized, citing bogus reasons for the shutdown. They're being sued by the National Labor Relations Board for illegally discriminating against their new union workers, withholding benefits for those workers that have been provided to the non-union workforce. That did not stop Starbucks from continuing the practice, flagrantly thumbing their nose at any sort of worker protections. That's all just the tip of the iceberg. In Buffalo alone, the city where this union wave started, the regional NLRB cited Starbucks with 200 violations of the National Labor Relations Act. Now, according to Jaffe, this approach, this incredibly aggressive approach, stems directly from Schultz's total existential freakout over the union wave. You come away from this piece with the distinct impression that Schultz takes the union drive as a direct personal affront, a challenge to his very sense of self. And actually, in a way, it really is. For the workers, this isn't really personal to Schultz. It's about having a say, having a living wage, having reliable hours. But Schultz can't maintain the lies he's told to himself about being that good guy of American capitalism, in the face of a lot of angry workers who are straight up telling him that his elaborately constructed fantasy is really just a pack of lies. So here's the Washington Post quoting Schultz at an executive meeting. "Why is this so personal to me?" he asked the executives in the room. Schultz stared down at the ground, his arms resting on his knees and his shoulders bent. "I know what it has taken to build this place. I know what's at stake right now," he continued, struggling to get the words out. "And we have to show up in a different way." The room fell silent. Schultz steadied himself. "And let me be honest with you," he told them, "time is not on our side." Now, Schultz has clearly tried on a variety of strategies for reconciling his personal self-image as a hero with the wildfire union wave that has exposed a mountain of legitimate grievances. At times, he makes up stories about how these worker organizers are really outside agitators unleashed on the company, part of some elaborate scheme to destroy Starbucks. At other times, he blames the workers' complaints on society at large, which is a good way to recognize legitimate concerns while blame shifting away from himself and Starbucks, thereby absolving the company of any responsibility to address those workers' grievances. Now, I saw some critiques that this piece was far too sympathetic to Schultz. I sympathize with that view. I mean, we can only expect so much from Bezos' paper ultimately. But really, I found it quite useful, because the more we learn about Schultz, the more we see he's ultimately not any different from any of the other billionaire masters of the universe. They each have their own self-serving mythology about why the way they treat their workers is okay, noble even. Perhaps it's a free market ideology. Perhaps it's a story about how much better they are actually treating their workers than at other companies. Or a story about how driving their workers like slaves is justified by the happiness or ease of their customers. But ultimately, they all come up with a way to behave in basically the same manner. An approach that is mandated for public companies by a fealty to shareholder value that demands that you screw over your workers while handing out goodies to your investors. That the personal ideology or vision or mythology of Schultz matters so little in the end, that's exactly the reason why the union movement is so critical. Schultz tells the Post that, quote, unions existed to protect workers from bad companies, like the ones who had abused his father. Quote, that's why unions were created, he said in an interview. A union had no place at a company that cared about its workers like Starbucks, Schultz believed. But of course, if Schultz actually cared about his workers, he would let them organize and he would remain neutral in the union campaigns. It all just goes to show that regardless of what story or personal billionaire mythology you wrap them in, corporations aren't ultimately good or bad. They exist to maximize shareholder value. Workers aren't organizing because Schultz is a good or bad guy, but because they deserve better. And the system that we've got isn't going to give it to them without a fight. Interesting look into how cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.